It was a gray afternoon in the city, the kind of day when the clouds hung low and the rain tapped softly against windows. In the richest part of town stood a mansion so large and perfect that people slowed their cars just to take a look. Owner Jonathan Hale was a man who had built his fortune from the ground up. He was proud of his hard work, proud of his success, and especially proud of his collection of rare cars. Inside his private garage sat vehicles worth more than most people could dream of. He loved them like treasures. Everyone who worked for him knew the rule: no one was allowed inside the garage without his permission. Lillian Carter, a 46-year-old woman, had started working at Jonathan's mansion only 2 weeks ago. She was the kind of person who did her job quietly. She didn't talk much, she didn't complain, and she always kept her eyes down when passing the other staff. Her hands moved quickly when she cleaned, and her polite "yes, sir" and "no" Maid made her seem almost invisible in the grand halls of the house. She needed the job badly, not just for herself, but for her teenage son at home. Every dollar counted, and losing this job wasn't something she could afford. That afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. Jonathan was in his study on the far side of the property, and most of the other staff were busy in the kitchen preparing for a small dinner party later that evening. Lillian had been assigned to dust the main hall and check the floors near the east wing. She moved from room to room, pushing her cleaning cart, humming softly to herself. As she passed the door to the garage, a heavy metal door that always stayed shut, she heard something unusual. It wasn't loud, but it caught her ear. A slow, steady dripping sound. She stopped, frowning. In her mind, she pictured water pooling somewhere, maybe falling on one of the expensive cars. She thought about how much trouble that could cause if the water damaged anything. She looked around. No one was in the hall. She told herself it would take only a second to peek inside. She reached for the handle and found it unlocked, which was strange. Slowly, she pushed it open, and the smell of motor oil and polished leather filled the air. Even though she didn't plan to step in far, her eyes widened as she looked around. Rows of gleaming vehicles stood in perfect order, classic models, racing legends, and custom-made machines. Each one looked like it belonged in a museum. She followed the sound and saw a small puddle forming under one of the cars. A thin stream of liquid was dripping from the engine area. She didn't touch anything. She just bent down slightly to see better. Her mind was already working, guessing where the problem might be. Years ago, she had spent hours in a small shed with her father, fixing old engines. The smell and sight of the car parts felt strangely familiar. It's almost comforting. Just then, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What are you doing in here?" She froze. Jonathan Hale stood in the doorway, his eyes cold and his jaw tight. Was wearing a tailored suit, but his voice carried the tone of someone who was not in the mood for excuses. Lillian straightened up quickly, her hands trembling. I heard a dripping sound," she said softly. "I thought it might be water." "I told the staff this garage is off limits," Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising. "Do you think I make rules for no reason? This is my private collection. No one comes in here." "I'm sorry, sir," she said, trying to explain. I didn't mean," but he didn't let her finish. His pride and protectiveness over his cars left no room for her words. "You're done here," he said flatly. "You can collect your things and leave. I don't need people who can't follow simple instructions." The sound of his voice was final. In the hallway outside, 2 other staff members had stopped to watch. Lillian felt their eyes on her, and her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She wanted to explain, to tell him she wasn't trying to snoop, but the words stayed stuck in her throat. She nodded, keeping her head low, and walked past him without another word. She went to the small staff room, picked up her worn handbag, and hung her uniform neatly on the hook. She didn't want to give anyone a reason to talk about her after she was gone. Outside, the rain was still falling, the air cool and damp. She pulled her coat tighter around her and began the long walk to the bus stop. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her thoughts kept circling the same questions. How would she tell her son she had lost another job? How would they pay the bills this month? She had done nothing wrong except try to stop a possible problem. but now she was the one paying the price. On the bus ride home, she stared out the window at the passing streets. She thought about her father again, about the way he used to teach her how to fix things. Engines have a language, he used to say. If you listen carefully, they'll tell you what they need. That same quiet dripping sound in the garage had told her something was wrong. She could have fixed it in an hour. But Jonathan had never given her the chance. When she stepped into her small apartment, her son was at the table doing homework. He looked up, saw her face, and immediately asked, "What happened?" She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She told him the truth, that she had been fired for going into the garage without permission. His brows drew together. "But Mom, you know more about engines than half the mechanics in this city," he said. If he had just listened, she raised her hand gently. "It's okay," she said, even though it wasn't. Inside, she felt a mix of frustration and sadness. She had been judged not for her intentions, but for stepping into a space she wasn't supposed to. That night, she lay awake, listening to the hum of the fridge in the kitchen and the soft breathing of her son in the next room. She couldn't stop thinking about that car, the puddle under it, and the way Jonathan's eyes had looked at her. Like she didn't belong anywhere near something so valuable. She didn't know it yet. But this small moment, this painful ending, was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would turn the same man who fired her into someone who would one day ask for her help. Lillian woke up early the next morning, even though she had no job to go to. The habit of rising before the sun was something she had kept for years. She sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of plain tea, her hands wrapped around it for warmth. The air in the apartment was cool, and the silence felt heavier than usual. She kept replaying yesterday in her mind Jonathan Hale's cold voice, the look of disappointment from the other staff, the sound of the rain as she walked away. Her son, Marcus, came into the kitchen rubbing his eyes. He was tall for his age, just 16, with the same sharp eyes his grandfather once had. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. He noticed she wasn't dressed for work and asked, "You're not going in today?" She shook her head and tried to smile. "I'm not working there anymore." Marcus frowned. "Because of the garage thing?" "Yes," she said softly. "Mr. Hale didn't want anyone in there. I should have known better." Marcus sat across from her and leaned forward. "Mom, you've told me 100 times you can't walk past an engine without wanting to check it. You saw something wrong, didn't you?" Lillian hesitated, then nodded. "I heard a leak. It could have been coolant or oil. Either way, leaving it like that can ruin the engine over time." But I didn't get the chance to explain. Marcus shook his head. "That's the thing. People think you're just a maid, but you know more about engines than most mechanics. If he knew your past, he wouldn't have acted like that." His words pulled her back into her memories. She could almost smell the old oil-stained floor of her father's workshop. She remembered being 10 years old, standing on a wooden crate. So she could reach the hood of a car. Her father, Henry Carter, had been a quiet man with a patient way of teaching. He believed that if something was broken, it deserved the chance to be fixed. She had grown up helping him repair tractors, pickup trucks, and old sedans for neighbors who couldn't afford to go to big city garages. It wasn't just about the machines, it was about trust. People came to her father because they knew he would tell them the truth and charge only what was fair. By the time Lillian was 16, she could rebuild an engine from scratch. She was proud of that skill, but life had other plans. Her father passed away suddenly, and with him went the small workshop they had built together. She had to find other work, and cleaning jobs were the easiest to get. Engines became a memory, a part of her past she didn't talk about much anymore. As she sat there in the kitchen with Marcus, she realized how much she missed it, not just fixing machines, but solving problems. Listening to the sound of an engine and knowing exactly what it needed. Meanwhile, crosstown Jonathan Hale was in a very different mood. He was standing in his garage with a famous car restorer from New York, showing off his collection. Jonathan took great pride in his cars, especially one rare vintage race car worth around $10 million. It was the jewel of his collection. The restorer crouched beside the car and frowned. "You've got a serious leak here," he said, pointing under the chassis. "And that's not just a loose bolt." This could be part of a deeper issue. Need someone to open it up, clean it out, and replace the worn seals. If you leave it, you're risking long-term damage. Jonathan's stomach tightened. How soon can you fix it? The man shook his head. I'm booked for the next few months. Everyone in the industry is. This kind of work isn't quick. And you need someone who knows what they're doing. This car's an antiquon wrong move and you could ruin it. Jonathan didn't like hearing the word wait. Especially not when there was an international exhibition in just 3 weeks. He had planned to showcase the car there. It was his chance to remind collectors around the world of his taste and influence. Without that car, his display would feel incomplete for the rest of the day. Jonathan called every expert he knew. Each one gave him the same answer. They were busy or they needed more time. He grew more frustrated with every phone call. That evening, he had dinner with a longtime friend, Peter Reynolds, who had known him since his early business days. Over steak and wine, Jonathan complained about his problem. Peter listened quietly, then said, "Funny thing, I know someone who might help. She's not a big-name restorer, but she's got hands like magic when it comes to engines." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Peter hesitated. "Her name's Lillian Carter." Jonathan almost laughed. "The maid I just fired?" Peter nodded. "Yeah, the same one. She's not just a maid, Jonathan. Her father was one of the best mechanics in his town. She learned from him and kept those skills sharp. I've seen her work. She fixed my old Chevy when 3 different garages couldn't figure it out." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, surprised. He had never imagined Lillian as anything more than the quiet cleaner who moved through his halls. The thought that she might be able to fix the one problem no one else could left him unsettled. That night, he sat in his study, looking at the clock, then at his phone. He didn't like admitting he might have been wrong about someone. The more he thought about the exhibition, the more he knew he didn't have a choice. While Jonathan wrestled with his pride, Lillian spent the evening helping Marcus with a small school project. He was building a miniature car model for his science class, and she showed him how to make the wheels turn smoothly. She didn't know that her life was about to cross paths with Jonathan's again at this time. Things would be very different. 2 days passed quietly for Lillian. She had started looking for new cleaning jobs in the neighborhood, though her heart wasn't in it. Every time she opened the classifieds, she thought about how hard it would be to explain to a new employer why she had left her last position after only 2 weeks. She kept reminding herself not to dwell on it. Life had taught her that holding on to bitterness only made the road ahead harder. On the 3rd morning, as she was sweeping the small balcony outside her apartment, she heard a car pull up. It wasn't the usual hum of a neighbor's sedan. This was deeper, smoother, the sound of an expensive engine. When she looked over the railing, she saw a black luxury car parked on the curb. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out. She froze for a second before realizing it was Jonathan Hale himself. Her first instinct was to go inside and close the door. But she stayed where she was. Jonathan looked up, met her eyes, and gave a small nod before walking toward the building. Entrance. Moments later, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, Jonathan stood there, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Lillian," he began, his voice softer than she remembered. "I need to talk to you." She didn't invite him in, but she also didn't close the door. "What is it, Mr. Hale?" she asked. He cleared his throat. "That car you saw in my garage, the one you thought had a leak it, turns out you were right. The engine has a serious issue. I've spoken to several experts, and none of them can fix it in time for the exhibition I'm attending in 3 weeks. Lillian crossed her arms. "And you came here because?" "Because I was told you might be able to help," he admitted. "Peter Reynolds spoke very highly of your skills. He said you could rebuild an engine in your sleep." She gave a short, dry laugh. "Funny, 2 days ago I was just a maid who couldn't follow rules." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "I was wrong," he said finally, "and I'm asking for your help now. I'll pay you triple what you earned before just for this job. All I need is for the car to be ready before the exhibition." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. She had no reason to help the man who had humiliated her, and part of her wanted to send him away. But another part, the part that loved, The challenge of solving a mechanical problem felt a flicker of interest. She missed the feeling of working on something intricate, the satisfaction of turning a silent engine into a living, breathing machine again. Still, she wasn't about to jump in without setting her own terms. "If I agree I work alone, she'll," said, "no one comes into the garage while I'm there. I'll need the keys, full access to tools, and no interference. When I'm done, you'll pay me what you promised." Jonathan nodded without hesitation. "Done. I'll also need to bring in some of my own tools," she added. "Some jobs require the touch of a hand that knows its tools well." He agreed again. She could tell he was desperate, though he was trying not to show it. The next morning, Jonathan's driver picked her up and took her back to the mansion. Walking through the gates again felt strange. She carried her tool bag in one hand, the same bag she had used for years when helping neighbors with repairs. When she reached the garage, Jonathan handed her the keys. "It's all yours," he said simply. The moment the heavy door swung open, the scent of oil, metal, and leather surrounded her. She walked straight to the race car, crouched down, and inspected the puddle beneath it. That the leak had been there for a while. She ran her fingers along the underside of the engine, feeling the faint traces of residue. Jonathan stood a few steps back, watching her, but she ignored him. She grabbed a cloth from her bag, wiped her hands, and then opened the hood. The sight of the engine made her heart beat faster, not because it was worth millions, but because it was beautifully built. Every part had been crafted with precision. But even the best machines aged, and this one had been neglected in small, costly ways. "You've got more than one problem here," she said, without looking at him. "If I just patch the leak, you'll be back in the same spot in a few months. The seals are worn, and there's buildup in the intake system. I'll need to take it apart completely." Jonathan didn't flinch at her words, though she noticed. His hands clenched slightly. "Do whatever you need," he said. With that, she began the slow, careful process of dismantling the engine. She laid each part neatly on a clean cloth, arranging them in the order she removed them. She examined every seal, every bolt, every line of tubing. Hours passed, and the garage was filled only with the soft sounds of tools clicking, metal shifting, and her steady breathing. Jonathan left her alone as promised, though she caught glimpses of him through the glass window now and then, watching her work. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted firing her, or whether he was simply focused on his prize car. By the end of the first day, the engine lay in carefully arranged pieces, each cleaned and inspected. She locked the garage, before leaving, carrying a small list of parts she would need to order. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, looking at her hands. They were sore and stained from grease, but she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet joy. She knew this wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about showing what she could do, proving that skill and knowledge didn't depend on titles or uniforms. She didn't realize it yet. But this job would do more than restore. A crit would also start to rebuild something far more difficult. Trust between two people who had begun on the wrong foot. For the next 2 weeks, the garage became Lillian's world. Every morning, Jonathan's driver picked her up at 8 sharp. She would step out with her tool bag in one hand, small thermos of coffee in the other, and walk straight into the garage without wasting a moment. The air inside always greeted her with that same familiar blend of oil, leather, and metal scent that felt like home to her. On the first few mornings, Jonathan tried to start polite conversations asking how things were going, but Lillian would only nod or give short answers before focusing on the engine. She wasn't trying to be rude. She just knew that once she started talking, her rhythm could break. The engine needed her full attention. Piece by piece, she cleaned, polished, and replaced what was worn out. Some parts were rare and couldn't simply be ordered online. For those, she used the old methods her father had taught her: hand filing, careful heat shaping, and measuring by feel as much as by sight. These were skills most modern mechanics didn't bother with anymore. But Lillian knew they were the only way to preserve the heart of a vintage machine. Sometimes Jonathan would pass by the glass window separating the garage from the side hall. He never stepped in unless it was to bring her water or check if she needed more light. At first, his visits made her uneasy, as if he were waiting to catch a mistake. But gradually, she noticed something different in his expression. It wasn't suspicion. It was curiosity. It was watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing. By the 5th day, the engine was completely dismantled. The pieces, big and small, were laid out on clean cloths across 2 long tables. It looked less like a machine and more like a work of art waiting to be assembled. Lillian stood over the parts with her arms folded, her mind working through each step of the rebuild like a chess player planning the next 10 moves. She started with the seals. They had been worn down from years of use, and replacing them required precision. She pressed each new seal into place with gentle, even pressure, making sure they sat perfectly in their grooves. Next came the pistons, polished until they shone under the garage lights. She handled them as if they were made of glass, even though she knew they were built to endure high heat and force. Some evenings, she stayed later than planned. Jonathan noticed but didn't say anything. He could see that she was treating his car not just as a job, but as a responsibility. He had hired experts before, people who charged more than she was earning, even now. But he couldn't remember any of them working with this level of dedication. One night, about halfway through the 2nd week, Jonathan stepped into the garage. While she was aligning the crankshaft, he leaned against the doorway for a moment before speaking. "You really love this kind of work, don't you?" Lillian didn't look up. "Engines don't lie," she said simply. "If something's wrong, they'll tell you, if you know how to listen. People, that's different." Jonathan knew she was talking about more than just cars, he thought. About the day he had fired her, about the way he hadn't let her explain herself. "I owe you an apology," he said after a pause. She glanced at him, her expression calm but unreadable. "You already said you were wrong. That's enough. The car's my focus now." Nodded and stepped back, respecting her boundaries. As the days passed, the engine began to take shape again. Each rebuilt section was stronger, cleaner, and more precise than before. Lillian checked every bolt twice, sometimes 3 times, tightening them just enough not to loose, not too tight. She knew that in a race car, balance was everything. By the final day before the exhibition, the engine looked brand new. Metal gleamed. The lines were spotless, and every part fit, as though it had just rolled out of the factory decades ago. Jonathan stood nearby as she lowered the hood, his hands resting on the fender. "All right," she said, stepping back. "Let's see if it remembers how to breathe." Jonathan climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the engine roared to life, deep, smooth, and powerful. The sound filled the garage, echoing off the walls. Jonathan's face broke into a grin, the kind that comes when something precious is returned to you better than you remembered it. "That," he said over the sound, "is perfect." Lillian allowed herself a small smile. "It's ready for the exhibition. But remember, keep it running regularly. Letting it sit too long is what caused half of these problems." Jonathan nodded. "You'll be there, won't you? To see it? In the spotlight?" She hesitated. "That's not really my world." "It is now," he said. "The people there should know who made this possible." She didn't answer right away, but deep down she felt a quiet sense of pride. Not because she wanted public recognition, because she knew she had done something only a handful of people in the world could have done it, and she had done it perfectly. That night, as she left the mansion, the air was cool and still. Hands were tired, her back ached, but there was a lightness in her step. She had rebuilt more than an engine in that garage. Without realizing it, she'd also rebuilt a bridge between herself and a man who had once judged her too quickly. What she didn't know was that the exhibition would not only change the way Jonathan saw her, it would open a door she had never imagined walking through. The day of the international exhibition arrived with a clear sky and a warm breeze. The event was being held at a massive convention hall on the edge of the city, a place where car lovers from all over the world gathered once a year. Rows of glass doors opened into a shining space filled with some of the rarest and most beautiful cars anyone could imagine. People dressed in fine suits and elegant dresses moved between the displays, their eyes wide with admiration. Jonathan Hale's prized vintage race car sat in one of the prime spots near the center of the hall, roped off with a polished stand. In front of it that read, restored to perfection. The paint gleamed under the lights, the chrome sparkled like silver, and inside, the newly rebuilt engine waited quietly for its moment to be heard. Lillian arrived quietly, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She wore a simple navy blue dress and carried nothing but her small handbag. She had almost decided not to come at all, but Marcus had insisted. "You worked on it," he told her. "You should see the world see it." He'd even polished her shoes that morning before she left. When she entered the hall, her eyes scanned the crowd until she saw Jonathan speaking with two well-dressed men. The moment he spotted her, he excused himself and walked over. "You came," he said, with a smile that seemed warmer than the one she was used to seeing. "You asked me to," she replied simply. "I'm glad. Stay close, you're going to. Want to hear what I say when the judges come around?" She raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. Instead, she stood near the back, letting her gaze wander over the other cars. There were sleek modern supercars, classic muscle cars, and restored vintage pieces from the early 1900s. Each had its own group of admirers. Still, she couldn't help but glance back at the car she had worked on, the one she knew down to the last bolt and sealed. An hour into the event, a small crowd began forming near Jonathan's display. The judges had arrived, 3 men and 1 woman, all respected experts in the world of rare automobiles. They moved slowly, asking questions, inspecting every detail. Jonathan answered politely, but when the head judge asked about the restoration work, Jonathan stepped aside and gestured toward Lillian. "This," he said, raising his voice slightly so more people could hear, "is the person responsible for bringing this car back to life. Her name is Lillian Carter. Without her, this car would not be here today." All eyes turned toward her. Lillian felt a sudden rush of heat to her face, but she forced herself to stand tall. The head judge stepped forward, clearly curious.
"How you
"Restored the engine?" "Yes," Lillian said, her voice steady. "It needed more than just a patch. I dismantled it completely, cleaned and rebuilt each part, and replaced what was too worn to save. I made sure it ran as it was meant to, smooth and strong." The judge nodded in approval. "Impressive. Very few people can handle an engine of this age and design. You've done exceptional work." For the rest of the day, more and more people stopped to speak with her. Collectors, mechanics, and even a few journalists asked questions about her methods. She kept her answers clear and simple, never exaggerating her skill, only explaining the care and time it had taken to do the job right. When the awards were announced later that afternoon, Jonathan's car was named the winner of Best Restored Classic. The applause was loud, and Jonathan turned immediately to shake Lillian's hand before stepping onto the stage to accept the trophy. In his short speech, he gave her credit once again, saying, "Sometimes the right person for the job isn't the one with the loudest reputation, it's the one who works quietly with skill and heart. That's Lillian." By the time the event ended, Lillian had collected several business cards from people offering her work. Some wanted her to restore their own classic cars, while others invited her to collaborate on projects. The thought of running her own restoration service began to take shape in her mind, though it still felt almost too big to believe. As the hall emptied, Jonathan walked her to the entrance. "I meant what I said," he told her. "You're the best mechanic I've ever met. I'd like to hire you permanently, no cleaning, just restoration work. Name your price." Lillian smiled faintly. "I appreciate that, but I think it's time I worked for myself. I have enough offers now to start something of my own. Besides, independence has its own value." Jonathan respected her decision. "You ever need a client, you know where to find me." That evening, Lillian returned home to find Marcus waiting by the window. When she told him about the offers she had received, his face lit up. "So, does this mean you're going to open your own shop?" She laughed softly. "It means we have some planning to do." Over the next few months, that's exactly what she did. She rented a small space in a quiet part of town, stocked it with the essential tools, and set up a sign that read, "Carter Restoration Engines Brought Back to Life." Word spread quickly, and soon she had more work than she could handle alone. One sunny afternoon, months later, Jonathan drove up in another one of his rare cars. He stepped out, wearing a relaxed smile. "I've got a new project for you," he said. She shook his hand. But this time not as an employee, and not as someone who needed his approval. Now, they spoke as equals a client and a respected professional. The memory of that rainy day when she had been fired still lived in both their minds, but it had changed shape. It was no longer just a story of unfair judgment, it was the starting point of a journey that had led to trust, an opportunity, and a second chance for both of them. And as Lillian got to work on his new car, the steady hum of her tools filled the shop, carrying the sound of a woman who had proven, beyond doubt, that skill and determination could rewrite any ending.